A question that I get a lot is, how did we get the Bible? And I remember back in the early 2000s when the Da Vinci Code came out. And there were all kinds of conspiracy theories, right, about the canon of Scripture and Constantine and how we got these texts, et cetera, et cetera. And none of those are remotely true, but nevertheless they made for a compelling story, and a lot of people believed them. But the actual process of canonization was a long, kind of bottom-up, organic process. There was no nefarious plot. There was no single council or agreement by which these works became canonical. The process was a lot slower and a lot more complicated than that. Now, when I use the term canon in reference to Scripture, what I mean is the collection of writings that make up the Old and New Testaments together, the Bible. Okay? The word canon is a Greek word that means rule or measuring rod. And we can also think of the canon as a list. So the canon of Scripture is this list of, in the Protestant tradition, 66 books that forms the rule or the measuring rod for Christian belief and Christian living. We have an Old Testament canon and a New Testament canon, and the Old and New Testaments together form what we call the Christian canon. One of the things that makes this confusing is that Roman Catholic Christians, Eastern Orthodox Christians, and Protestant Christians have different Old Testament canons from one another. Even different Orthodox churches sometimes differ from one another in the list of books that they include within the Old Testament. Among Christian groups, the Protestant Old Testament is the most like the Hebrew Bible. It contains the same basic set of writings, but the books are arranged differently. The Protestant Old Testament has 39 books, whereas the Jewish Bible has 24 books. But that's because Ezra and Nehemiah are one book, 1st and 2nd Samuel are one book, 1st and 2nd Kings are one book, 1st and 2nd Chronicles are one book, and the 12 minor prophets are one book. There's no scholarly consensus really about the way in which the Old Testament canon was formed. It probably solidified between the year 200 BC and 200 AD through a slow and gradual process. And different Jewish groups didn't always use the same set of texts as one another. Now, in the year AD 70, the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans. In fact, all of Jerusalem was destroyed, and it was really a catastrophe, and Judaism had to reorganize itself, and it did under the leadership of the rabbis. Prior to AD 70, Judaism was much more diverse than it was after AD 70, and it may be that the formation of the Old Testament canon, or the formation of the Jewish canon, was a result of the consolidation of leadership under the rabbis and the development of a more uniform or orthodox form of Judaism after the destruction of the temple. The truth is, we really don't know. The Bible of the early church, however, at least in the generation following Jesus, was not the Hebrew Bible. It was a Greek translation of these texts that we call the Septuagint. And the Septuagint included certain books within it that were not in the Jewish Bible or the Hebrew Bible. Little by little, Christians began to collect their own works and to see some of these writings as having the same kind of authority as the works of the Septuagint. And so over time, really beginning in the 2nd century, a specifically Christian set of writings began to be developed and understood as authoritative and scriptural. Probably the earliest section of the New Testament to come together was the fourfold collection of the Gospels. This happened sometime during the 2nd century. In the late 2nd century, around the year 180, the church father Irenaeus claimed that just as there were 4 principal winds, 4 pillars that hold up the sky, 4 corners of the universe, it is only right that we should have 4 gospels. Irenaeus' reference to the fourfold gospel indicates that these collections existed by around 180 at the latest. Not everyone accepted the fourfold gospel, however. A Christian named Dayton created a work called the Diatessaron, and the Diatessaron was a harmony of the 4 gospels. In other words, he tried to make one story out of the 4 stories and blended them all together. The Diatessaron was used in Syriac-speaking churches into the 5th century. We also know that by the late 2nd century, along with the 4 Gospels, Paul's letters, 1 Peter, and 1 John were widely considered authoritative among Christians. Other writings, like 1 Clement, the Epistle of Barnabas, the Didache, and the Shepherd of Hermas, were also highly esteemed at times. In fact, into the 4th century, these writings were used more widely and continuously than some writings that made it into the New Testament, like James, 2 Peter, and 2nd and 3rd John. A list written by Bishop Eusebius, who's often considered the father of church history, indicates that by the year 25, at least 20 of the 27 books we have in the New Testament canon today were widely in use. It's not until 367, however, that we get the earliest attestation to the 27-book New Testament canon. And that comes in a letter from a bishop, Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria. Even after this, there were other lists that vary from Athanasius's, mainly in leaving out or questioning certain writings. A basic consensus between the churches in the East and the West seems to have come together around the early 5th century. But this still leaves us with the question of why Christians developed a canon to begin with. Now, older scholarship has tended to see the formation of the canon as the result of a power struggle in the early church. There were certain groups that today we might call heterodox or heretical that were saying things that a number of early Christian leaders didn't like, and the formation of the canon is a response to that. That's the idea. The most famous of these early heretical Christian leaders is called Marcion. Okay, now, Marcion believed that there should be no Old Testament. He thought that the God of the Old Testament was not the God of love expressed in the New Testament, and he tried to get all the Jewish elements out of the New Testament as well. And so his New Testament consisted of an edited version of the Gospel of Luke and 10 of Paul's letters. Marcion didn't win the day. In fact, he was excommunicated. And some people say that Marcion, more than anyone else, really drove the formation of the New Testament canon. But that's probably not right. Remember that it's 367 before we get a list that indicates the 27-book New Testament canon that we have today. That's 2 centuries after Marcion. And so if Marcion really was the driving force behind the formation of the canon, why is it that it took 200 years or so for Christians to finally arrive on these 27 books? There were other interpretations of the Christian witness floating around about this time in the early centuries of Christian faith that the leaders of the emerging Catholic Church just didn't agree with. And sometimes we group some of these together and call them Gnostics. Nobody in the ancient world called themselves Gnostics. That's a modern term we have for these groups. Some people have suggested that it's because of the emergence of Gnosticism that we formed the canon, but that probably wasn't the case either. It's probably not in response to heretical or heterodox movements that the church began to form its canon of Scripture. The formation of the canon was a much more bottom-up and organic process than that. it probably wasn't the result of a power struggle. It wasn't a bunch of guys sitting around in a back room somewhere smoking cigars and trying to figure out which books would be in and which books would be out. Rather, as we're going to see in another session, the canon comes to us out of the worshiping life of early Christian communities.